G'day friends, it's Andrew Goodall here again from Nature's Image Photography, and today I'm returning to one of the most popular themes I've covered on my YouTube channel, and that's macro photography. I'll be sharing some photographs and telling you the settings, sharing a few tips and techniques. But before we get started, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button. I've always got something new coming up in my world of photography, and subscribing is easily the best way to keep in touch with what's new. Now, I can't promise that the tips and techniques are going to be so very different to the last time I did a video about macro. The difference is now the location. The first time I did a YouTube video on macro was during the home shutdown period, and I was confined to taking photographs in my garden at home. But now things have changed in Queensland and I'm allowed to get out and about. And I've come down now to the Lake Currimundi Nature Reserve at Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast. And it's just the time of year when the wildflowers are starting to come out, so I thought it was a perfect time to come down and do a bit of macro photography. Now, equipment-wise, I'm using again my Pentax K3 Mark II, and I've got the Tamron 90mm macro lens, the f2.8 on there. If anyone's wondering what's happened to my Panasonic Lumix G9, that's the camera I'm using to film this video. So the Lumix is over there. The Pentax is the one I'm using for these photographs. I've also got the camera set up on a tripod, as you can see. I won't necessarily do all the photographs on a tripod. If I come down here over a few days in the making of this video and do some in sunlight and some in shadow, I might do some handheld as well. But right now it's quite cloudy and the light's dropping, so I'll be using my tripod for the first few shots I'm going to show you. And I've also got my remote release cable. It's just a simple little push button remote, but it's a nice easy way to make sure that when I press the button I don't shake the camera. When you're doing any sort of nature photography, including macro, you have to be mindful of the conditions, and today being a bit cloudy and the light being low, it does make sense to keep a tripod handy. Now, my first subject of the day is these little tiny yellow flowers. They're a beautiful little subject for a macro photograph, but they're very tiny, and to get a good close-up shot I do have to bring the camera very close, and that brings in all the problems you tend to have with macro photography. Our theory tells us that the closer you get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field becomes. So when you are this close to your subject, the depth of field is tiny, and that means not only does my focus have to be precise, but I can't normally expect to get too much of the flower in front and behind the tiny little point that I focus on to stay sharp, because the depth of field is so shallow, and that's one of the reasons I'm using my tripod. So let me talk you through the settings. Before I get to aperture and shutter speed, I want to point out I'm using manual focus. That's because I want to be really precise with my focus, and using a tripod of course makes manual focus easier because the camera stays locked in place, so once you focus, the focus stays where it was. Now, in terms of the camera settings, if I take my photos handheld, I really want the shutter speed to be super fast, like you know, over 1,000th of a second. But on a cloudy day, like it's getting a little bit duller now, the sun's just come out a tiny bit, but the light's still pretty soft. I would need to put the ISO way up in order to keep the shutter speed fast, but of course that sacrifices image quality. Using a tripod I don't have to do that. So let's go through these settings. Now, I've got my shot lined up, and if I take the photograph at f2.8, I can take this photograph at a 200th of a second. I'm using my remote release to make sure I get the best out of the tripod, because I can't bump the camera when I take the photo. And there's my first shot. But the depth of field is going to be tiny. Now, again, I've used manual focus in order to make sure I can see even the veins inside the petals of the flower, which is great. But because the flower has a bit of three-dimensional depth to it, it won't all be in focus at f2.8. Now, to really increase that depth of field, what I'm going to do is close the aperture down, and I'll close it down to, let's say, f11. That'll give me quite a lot more depth of field, but that means slowing my shutter speed down to a 15th of a second. Now, there's no way I could do this handheld. That'd be nuts. But I can do it quite successfully on a tripod. What I do have to wait for is a little moment when there's no breeze blowing, and in macro world it doesn't take much breeze to to knock your flower around, but when everything's nice and perfectly still, take that shot. Now that one was taken at a 15th of a second at f11. I'll show you the results and you'll see the depth of field brings out a lot more detail in the flower. Okay, so now I've taken a few versions of these flowers and it's time to move on to some other subjects. But before I do, I want to address something that came up after my last video in some of the comments, and that was people saying that they would never use a tripod for macro photography because it's way too impractical. And the truth is, a lot of the time it is. You wouldn't be using a tripod so much on a windy day. You certainly wouldn't be using a tripod if you were chasing bees that were buzzing around from flower to flower. You need to keep your camera a lot more mobile. But in certain situations it makes sense. And here I've got flowers. I'm not trying to chase insects. It's not a particularly windy day, so the flowers are relatively still. And I'm on a path which is nice and open. I can set up my tripod without bumping the flowers. A lot of people said that when you're setting up a tripod you're likely to knock the flowers around so much and you'll scare the bugs away. Well, again, I'm not shooting bugs. I've got a nice open path so I can set my tripod up without interfering with the flowers. Now the discipline of using the tripod allows me to choose the aperture and shutter speed I want instead of being stuck with a wide open aperture and a fast shutter speed or having to put the ISO way up. So using a tripod gives me the freedom to choose the settings I feel like using instead of being stuck with a certain set of settings that I have to use. Now I found my second subject, which is these little tiny white flowers. In the meantime it's gotten quite a lot darker, the clouds are getting a lot heavier and the light's getting lower, but I've got the added challenge now that I'm shooting a white subject. And white subjects, just by their nature, are brighter than everything else around them. So if you're using evaluative metering, which I do, that means the camera's taking its meter reading from the entire frame of the shot, and the majority of the shot's quite dark. So what the camera wants to do is let in extra light in order to brighten up the darker areas, and the outcome will be I'll end up with overexposed flowers. So what I need to do is take a darker photograph than what the camera wants me to. Now some people would prefer to change their metering mode to spot metering, but I don't like to do that. I like to stick with evaluative metering all the time. But I am shooting in manual mode, which means I can easily override what the camera wants just by setting a faster shutter speed. So right at the moment, the camera's telling me, if I start at f2.8, to shoot this shot at a 20th of a second. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to shoot it at a 40th of a second, which is a few notches faster. And using my 2-second delay now because I really don't want to bump the camera. There's my first shot. Now that was a few bars left of centre on the light meter, and that gives me a better exposure on the white flowers. I've underexposed the background a bit, but who cares? It's the flowers that matter. Now that shot gives me the shallowest depth of field I can get. I've got a correct exposure, but the depth of field is very shallow. So now I'd like to take the same shot again, but do it at a few different aperture settings. Remembering, of course, when I change the aperture, I've got to slow the shutter speed down even further. So now I'm going to take the same shot at f8. Now that'll give me more depth of field, but it darkens everything down. So I'm slowing my shutter speed down to, this looks like a 1/6 of a second. Still using the 2-second delay, and I've got to wait for a moment when there's no breeze. And just for good measure, I'm going to take one, let's say at f14, but then I've got to slow the shutter speed down even further again. Now it's really critical at this point that there's no movement at all when I press the button, so I've got to make sure there's no wind. I'm on a 1/2 second exposure now. I can just feel a bit of breath of wind, so let's wait another moment, and when this shot's done I'll show you the results and I'll show you the settings along with them. So I'm back now for my second visit, and I'm starting my second visit in the exact same place where I finished my first visit. I'm going to be photographing these same little yellow flowers again. The difference is the conditions today are very different, and you'll remember previously I mentioned that with anything to do with outdoor nature photography, and that includes macro, you've got to be mindful of the conditions. Today it's a very sunny day. There's some little tiny clouds occasionally going across the sun, and it's also a little bit breezy. Now for those two reasons, you'll probably notice one major difference is I'm going to be doing my photography handheld. Now sunny means the light's a lot brighter, and that means it's easier to keep my shutter speeds up, and wind almost makes a tripod useless, because there's no point keeping your camera stock still and steady when your subject's going to be blowing back and forward. So now I'm going to be shooting photographs handheld. Now what does that mean for my settings? It does mean I have to do things quite differently, because now I really need my shutter speed to be above about 1/1000th of a second, simply to eliminate camera shake. Regardless of movement of the subject, just to keep the camera steady enough for a sharp photo, I want to keep my shutter speed at something faster than 1/1000th of a second. Now, as long as the sun's out, I can probably do that at 200 ISO, and if I'm lucky, if it's bright enough, I might be able to shoot at 200 ISO, keep the shutter speed above 1/1000th of a second, and still have my aperture down, maybe to f5.6 or so, to get that little tiny bit more depth of field. But if the light drops a little bit, if the sun goes behind a cloud, I'll be having to put the ISO up. So I will be doing things quite differently. I'll also be having to deal with autofocus or manual focus, and figuring out which way to best get that with a moving subject that's blowing back and forward slightly. So the approach will be quite different. Once again, when the whole thing's done, I'll show you some of my favourite photographs from the shoot, and I'll show you the settings as well. Okay, I don't know if you can see the flowers on this bush in the video. They're very tiny, but there's a lot of flowers on the bush, which gives me plenty of choice of angles to shoot from. So now I'm going to have a look at my camera settings. Again, quite different because it's a sunny day. Now at f2.8 at 200 ISO, I can shoot at about 1/3200th of a second. Now that's not just fast enough to eliminate camera shake, it's probably a lot faster than I need. And at f2.8, once again, the depth of field is probably going to be shallower than I want. I'll struggle to get the whole flower in focus. So rather than shoot at f2.8 and a much faster shutter speed than I need, I'm going to close the aperture down, let's say to f5. That'll give me more depth of field, and it means closing the shutter speed down to a 12/50th of a second. But that's okay, because that's fast enough to eliminate camera shake. It'll give me a nice fast shutter speed, but a little bit more depth of field so that I can get all the details of the flower in focus if possible. Now the flower has some little tiny filaments on some curled up sections, which you'll see when I show you the close-ups, and I want to make sure they're nice and sharp. The trick is trying to get your focus where you want it, and then keep it where you want it. Now I'm using autofocus at the moment, and I mentioned this in my previous video on macro photography. Rather than focusing and then refocusing every second that I'm moving and the flower's moving back and forward, what I'll do, I'm using autofocus single, is focus once and just keep my finger on the button, and then I can move back and forward as much as I like, because the focus won't change. So then I just come in closer, and in the moment everything I want is sharp, I press the button. And you'll notice I'm working in high-speed continuous, so when I press the button it takes a couple of shots. It's not a bad idea, because you usually find that out of 3 or 4 shots you shoot, there's always one that's a little bit sharper than all the others. So I'm using a combination of focus, shutter speed, and a slightly smaller aperture in order to try to keep my photograph as sharp as I possibly can. Now in terms of that exposure, I said I was shooting at a 12/50th of a second at f5. Now according to my light meter, I should be shooting at a 500th of a second at f5. Let's just take one of those shots for comparison. But again, we've got a flower that's quite a lot brighter than the background behind it. So just like the situation I had before, if I have my light meter in the middle, or I take the exposure the camera wants me to take, I'm probably going to overexpose the flower. But by setting the shutter speed faster, I darken the shot down. So I'm concentrating on getting my flower correctly exposed and not too worried if I underexpose the background. So once again, I'm going up to a 12/50th of a second, and I'll take that shot. Now, one thing I'm realising with this flower that I'm shooting, it's a long thin flower and it's pointing down, which makes it a very vertical shape. And it's worth remembering when you're shooting a vertical subject to consider turning your camera sideways and making a vertical photograph out of it. A lot of people get so used to taking all their photos like that, they often forget that this is an option. And when your subject largely runs vertically, it makes sense to at least try turning the camera sideways and making a vertical shot out of it. So I'll do a couple of those now. So there you have it. I'm thinking about everything to do with this photograph: the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, the weather conditions, the time of day I'm shooting, and even the composition. It all makes a difference to creating a good photograph. Now, for the rest of the afternoon, I'm going to wander around using those same similar techniques, and I'll see how many flowers I can shoot in a couple of hours. And when I get home, I'll put the whole thing together into a video, and I hope you enjoy the results. So here we are now at the end. I've now made 3 visits to the nature reserve, and hopefully by now I've put together a big enough collection of photographs to be worth sharing with you. I hope you enjoy what you see, and I hope for the beginners that you've learned something. Now, right here at the end, I do want to finish with a few words of encouragement, in particular for the beginners. And they might not seem very encouraging at the start, but keep on listening and hopefully you'll get where I'm coming from. Macro photography. It's really hard. It is probably the most challenging type of photography you'll ever take on, especially macro out in nature, where you can't control the elements, the wind might be blowing, the light's always changing, the bugs might be moving and that kind of thing. But that's what makes it so rewarding when you start seeing good results. Don't expect every shot to be a winner. If I go out and take 200 photos in an afternoon, if I bring home 20 good ones, I'm happy. Out of those 20, I'll hope there'll be 5 really top shots. But it is low success rate stuff, so don't expect every shot you take to be an award winner. But your success rate does get better as you go along. So keep on practicing, and if you're a genuine beginner, start with simple stuff and work your way up. Just stick with the basic techniques, and you will find it gets better with practice. And of course, the more your results come, the more rewarding the whole thing becomes, and you realise that it was worth the effort after all. And for the experts out there who already know their macro photography, I'm well aware that in this video and my previous one as well, I'm really just touching on some basic techniques. I haven't talked about some of the advanced stuff. I haven't even mentioned flash, which is a big thing for some people in macro photography. That's a whole other world, and that's something I might touch on in some of my future videos. But for now, I'm really just trying to teach the beginners some essential techniques to help them get started. So I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned something. I'll finish now with just a few more of my favourite pictures from the outing. Well, I'm Andrew Goodall. This is Nature's Image Photography. Thanks for watching.